Boston, 1985. In the quiet warmth of a small cafe, nestled near Copley Square, with its stained glass windows casting amber light on patrons who sought refuge from the hum of city traffic, an elderly man arrived every Friday evening and sat at the grand piano in the corner, his posture upright yet hesitant, as if each note he played carried the weight of stories untold and years of unspoken memories. His name was Samuel Rosen, a World War II veteran whose hands, though lined with age and steadied by discipline, touched the ivory with a tenderness that quieted conversations and pulled time inward. The regulars, professors grading papers, elderly men sipping tea, people escaping work, with whom he shared the comfortable assumption that he was merely another kindly old man playing classical melodies, never suspected the significance buried in his repertoire. That evening, rain pattered softly against the cafe's windows and golden streetlights shimmered on wet pavement like scattered stars. Samuel closed his eyes and struck a chord. Instead of a familiar Chopin nocturne or stately Gdef major ballade, he began to play an old Yiddish lullaby, Oifen Pripetchik, a song about a Rebbe teaching children the alphabet, a melody woven with nostalgia and unspeakable sadness, famously containing the lines, "When you children grow older, you'll understand how many tears lie in these letters." In a back corner sat a woman watching him, Evelyn Greenberg, a Holocaust survivor who had resettled in Boston many years before, her presence in the cafe silent and reserved, her gaze fixed on Samuel with recognition not shared by anyone else. Her mother used to sing that lullaby when Evelyn was a child, hiding in cellars and shelters beneath shattering skies. Now the melody, light, fragile and achingly familiar, floated in the air, closing wounds she thought she had buried long ago. Her breath caught. A single tear rolled down her cheek, tracing the faint lines of memory she had carefully guarded. She wasn't the only one who'd stopped listening to time. The cafe grew still, chairs scraped. Even the shelves of books behind the counter seemed to pause. Samuel's fingers trembled ever so slightly as the final notes faded like a whisper. He opened his eyes and noticed her, really saw her. For the first time, not as a stranger, but as someone who carried the memory of that lullaby in her soul. And in that moment, something shifted. A seed of connection planted in silence, waiting to bloom, waiting for a story to be told at last. If this story moves you as deeply as it moved me, please like and subscribe. It helps us keep sharing real, resonant stories that touch, inspire, and surprise. And now, brace yourself, because what comes next will change everything. That Friday night, when the soft glow of candlelight mingled almost imperceptibly with the amber street lamp reflections on rain-slicked pavement, Evelyn Greenberg sat perfectly still, as though memory itself had weighed her into the chair, her gaze fixed on Samuel Rosen, who played the Yiddish lullaby with such quiet reverence that it sounded like a prayer offered in the dark, pulsing with the res. Onance of unsung losses and unimaginable survival. She felt years collapse in that single moment, her breath caught between past and present, unable to distinguish whether she trembled from grief or relief. And yet, beneath the tremor, she recognized in him not just the veteran whose presence had become part of the cafe's evening ritual, but someone who unknowingly cradled her childhood in the cradle of that song. When the last note lingered like a fluttering breath and drifted away into the hush, she realized her fingers were trembling, not with cold, but with something more fragile, something rooted deep in heartbeats that had learned to hide. She rose, slowly, her chair scraping softly against the quiet floor, and walked toward him as though guided by a current of memory that refused to be silenced. Her lips parted, her voice so soft it threatened to shatter, but it carried, "That song, you played it just now. Do you understand what it means?" She paused, her eyes seeking something in his. Recognition, perhaps, or confirmation that the world she carried inside her was reflected in him. Samuel turned, his hands still resting on the keys, clouded expression dawning into something slow and tremulous. I didn't mean to," he began, voice low but steady, as though each word had been balanced carefully on the bridge between memory and fear. "I learned it long ago. It's a lullaby I taught to a child, to help her sleep, to calm storms she never spoke of." His fingers flexed against the worn piano wood, as though testing the weight of the confession. "I never spoke of it because I was afraid that if I did, I would call her name into the open air, and then I would lose her all over again." Evelyn felt a rustle in her chest, like old pages turning in a diary. She could taste the edge of grief and recognition. She swallowed and whispered, "Her name was Ruthie. She was the child my parents hid. And then you brought comfort. You didn't know." Her voice cracked on the edge of the words. Each syllable pressed the ghosts of silences into the corners of the room. Samuel's eyes widened, and tears glimmered there, tears that spoke of promises kept, of memory preserved in melody. The cafe, once a warm refuge, felt suddenly small, full of unseen listeners, of histories converging at that piano. People looked up softly, invisibly aware that something fragile and sacred was unfolding. And then Samuel closed his eyes, breathed a tremulous breath and said, "I can't promise to bring her back, but perhaps together we can bring her song into the light." With a trembling nod, Evelyn allowed the weight of decades fall away. She sat beside him and leaned close, as though leaning into forgiveness, into acknowledgement, into something far bigger than either had dared to speak. At that moment, the lullaby was no longer just a memory. It was a bond unbroken by years of silence, gathering strength in the space between their hearts. As their fingers drifted toward the piano keys again, this time intentionally together, the song began, not buried in sorrow, but rising, stronger than before, carrying both their stories forward. In the echo of that second rendition, as Evelyn sings the lullaby softly beside him, they both feel the pull of memory drawing them back, not just to the night she was hidden, but to the moment he found her, as a young soldier in a world torn apart, and that melody became their silent promise. In the oppressive heat of midsummer 1944, as thunder rumbled overhead and the forest outside trembled with distant artillery fire, a young American soldier named Samuel Rosen moved cautiously through a bombed-out village near the German border, his heart pounding not from fear, but because of an urgent sense that he was not alone. And in a collapsed basement, beneath broken beams and scattered he discovered a small woman cradling a child barely old enough to speak, the girl's voice soft as a memory, humming a lullaby his mother had once taught him in a gentler time. And the lyrics, so sweet, so fragile, were Yiddish, a language he recognized only from distant church choir friends, now sounding like home. The woman's knuckles were white as she held the child close, murmuring the same lullaby, "Eufen pripetschik brenta feil, an in stabis haze," her voice trembling, as if the words themselves held her breathing steady in the chaos around them. And when Samuel knelt beside them, offering his canteen and quiet words of reassurance, the child looked up with wide, fearful eyes, then clutched her mother more tightly and returned to that lullaby, weaving the notes into the darkness like a thread of light through night. Moved by something older than duty, Samuel gently placed his hand over hers, thoughtful and careful, and joined in the lullaby, his voice low and uneven, allowing the melody to carry grief and hope at once, a silent promise woven between syllables, that she would be safe, that someone heard her song, that he would not let the notes die in that rubble. And the sound became more than a lullaby. It became a lifeline, binding them together in that broken cellar, offering protection that rubble could not destroy. In the following days, Samuel smuggled extra rations to them. He cleared safe paths to bring blankets and water. He shielded their hidden location with expansions of the resistance network, trusting that some soldiers were more than fighters, they were guardians of memory and survival. Each night he returned to the cellar, sat on shattered brick, and there, in the dim lantern glow, let the child's voice rise through the lullaby, reassuring her that despite cracks and ruin, there was still warmth, still life. And he memorized every note, every trembling phrase, until the melody lived inside him, becoming a vessel for hope. But survival during war is fragile. One night, as thunder and artillery explosions converged above, a squad of enemy soldiers, following suspicious rumors of resistance activity, cornered Samuel as he tried to guide the mother and child away from their hiding place. He stood between them and the soldiers, raising his rifle not to strike but to buy time, his voice steady when he whispered for them to run. The mother clutched the child, and as they slipped into shadow, she lifted a trembling face and whispered, nearly breathless, "Teach her the song," before they vanished through a hidden passage. Samuel's arms ached, but he stood firm, tears brimming as he watched them disappear, the lullaby's final echoes still echoing in his mind. Then he turned, heart shattered by absence, and let the enemy find him, knowing that his silence afterward, his refusal to speak of what happened, was less shame and more survival tactic, a way to preserve the song, the promise, and the secret covenant he had made in that cellar with a child's lullaby. And though the war raged on, and many days passed in whispering memories, Samuel carried the melody with him, not as a burden, but as a vow. And when he came home, stared into the faces of strangers passing in the crowd, he carried silent grief for a child he never named, and a lullaby that he dared promise to keep alive, even if saying her name would shatter the bond that song formed. Every time Samuel plays that lullaby years later in the cafe, and Evelyn recognizes it, they step closer to the memory of that night, the hidden child, the fractured lullaby, the promise that song would be kept alive, even in silence. It was late afternoon when Evelyn returned to the cafe and found Samuel seated at the piano, his hands resting lightly on the keys as if waiting for permission to speak. And when she sat across from him, light filtering through dusty panes, she looked at him not as the elderly pianist, but as the young soldier who once held a frightened child's lullaby in his heart. And when she spoke, her voice trembled but remained steady, like a fragile stone placed firmly. "You kept the song all these years. I recognized it, not just because it was familiar, but because it belonged to me." Samuel's breath caught, and his face, marked by age and silent regret, wavered. He closed his eyes, inhaling slowly as though drawing strength from the memory of every night he returned to the basement hiding place. "I didn't speak," he said, voice faint but unwavering, "because I feared that if I named it, if I acknowledged too clearly that lullaby belonged to a child, I would summon her memory so loudly that it would break me." His hands lifted slightly, fingers touching one another, as though they too carried invisible strain. "My silence was not denial, it was protection. For that child, for the memory of her voice. I believed if I even spoke her name, I might be betraying the promise to keep her song alive." Evelyn's heart clenched, and she leaned forward, the chair softly creaking. She reached out and placed her hand over his. It felt like two lifelines brushing in the dark. "I carried the silence too," she confessed, voice low but resolute, "because the lullaby was the only link to a mother I lost, and I thought if I shared it, I would lose what remained of her completely." Her eyes glistened with tears she'd never allowed herself to name, yet there they were, shining with recognition and shared grief. We both carried the lullaby, each in our way. You in silence, me in memory. The soft hum of the cafe felt distant, almost irrelevant, as if the world outside ceased to matter. In that moment, Samuel lifted his head, and Evelyn saw in his eyes an ache that mirrored her own. Two stories woven into the same melody, bound by a promise neither had named until now. He swallowed and exhaled a breath that seemed to lift layers of time. "I only ever hoped that song would survive, in my hands, in my heart. I didn't know who it belonged to, but I believed in the promise of memory beyond war and loss." Evelyn nodded slowly, clutching his hand as though holding a fragile truth. "I know now that my mother sang it for me, to reassure me when there was nothing else left," she whispered. "And you learned it from me by saving me. It belonged to both of us. In your hands, it lived." Her words fell softly between them, binding them closer than decades of silence had dared to. Time seemed to stop. Around them, the cafe took a breath of understanding, as if each candle flicker and every faded photograph on the wall held witness to this confession. He met her gaze with a tenderness that transcended time. "Will you help me play it again?" he asked, voice fragile and hopeful. "Together? Not in quiet remembrance, but out loud, so that the lullaby is no longer silent?" Evelyn nodded, tears gliding down her cheeks. Her voice was steady. "Yes, let it be our song. We can speak through music what words have failed to say." And as she moved to sit beside him, placing her hand over his, they inhaled together the weight of all they had carried and exhaled through the melody that bound them. Their fingers, guided by years of unspoken longing, brushed the piano keys together. The first notes of the lullaby rose, gentle and clear, weaving between them. It was no longer just a song. It was an act of mutual healing, a reclamation of a promise, a vow turning into shared melody. As the lullaby echoes once more, Evelyn and Samuel stand ready, no longer silent bearers of memory, but duet partners poised to bring the song into the world as a living testament to survival, love, and the power of reclaimed voice. On a crisp autumn evening in the heart of downtown Boston, the community center's auditorium was dimly lit by gentle sconces that cast halos of light across the assembled crowd. Survivors, descendants, local citizens, and students, with anxious attention drawn toward the small stage where Evelyn and Samuel stood side by side, their fingers poised above the piano keys, carrying not only a melody, but the weight of history, the weight of memory and renewed promise, ready to be shared. As Samuel pressed the first note of the Yiddish lullaby, a hush descended, so complete that even the distant hum of the city seemed to listen, his aged fingers trembling briefly before settling into steady resolve. Evelyn's hand placed gently atop his, and together they coaxed the fragile melody into the hush, filling the space with something altogether bigger than music. A communal exhale, a breath of healing carried on strings of sound that shimmered with remembrance. In the audience, a woman with silver hair reached for the hand of the man next to her, her husband, whose childhood had been shaped by stories of hidden grandparents and forgotten songs, now bringing tears to his eyes. A young student shifted in her seat, her eyes wide with recognition, connecting her own fragmented heritage with the fragile notes. Others pressed palms to their chests, bearing witness to the transformation of sorrow into solidarity as the lullaby rose from memory into shared ceremony. With each rising phrase, the audience felt their own histories resonate in the melody. Families who had escaped persecution, children who carried names of places that no longer existed, neighbors who rebuilt lives brick by brick. They recognized that in the haunting refrain, "When you children grow older, you will understand how many tears lie in these letters," were not just lyrics, but living testament to endurance, to the enduring power of memory as a bridge across generations. When the final notes trembled into silence, the audience rose, not merely out of politeness, but in authenticity, incited by emotion weaving through them. Some carried tissue in trembling hands, others closed eyes and held corners of lace scarves to their lips, and the air pulsed with unspoken gratitude, as if the lullaby had become a shared heartbeat, a living link between past and present. Afterward, at a small ceremony held in the cafe where Samuel first played the lullaby, a modest brass plaque was unveiled, inscribed simply, "Where a song saved a life." The words glowed softly in the lamplight, a reminder that courage can be quiet, that gestures small and secret can ripple outward through time. Patrons paused by the plaque, reading it with reverence in their eyes, remembering that history happens not only in grand monuments, but also at simple wooden tables, warmed by first sips of coffee. Local reporters described the event as more than a concert. They spoke of it as a living cultural act of reconciliation, as a moment when music reclaimed memory for a community that needed shared stories to remember who they were and what they carried. Letters poured in afterward, teachers who introduced the lullaby in classrooms, choir directors who arranged it for communal singing, festival organizers who invited Evelyn and Samuel to perform at remembrance ceremonies. Within weeks, the melody became a symbol of local memory, appearing at interfaith services, school assemblies, and cultural festivals, now more than foreign syllables, but echoes of resilience, reminders that representation and remembrance may live in simple lullabies. One historian noted that Oyfun Pripetshik, originally about teaching alphabet to children, had become an enduring testament. How memory burned like fire in letters, and how protest, as well as love, lives in melody. The cafe itself, once an ordinary place of weekly ritual, became a beacon. People lingered by the piano, often playing a whispered fragment of the lullaby themselves, or simply standing in quiet reflection beside the plaque that testified to the miracle of memory, survival, and song. Parents brought children there and told them softly the story of the old veteran and the woman who wept, so that memory might live again, not as museum relic, but as human understanding. And now, after sharing their story with the world, Evelyn and Samuel stand at the threshold of a final act, not just of remembrance, but of invitation. For in their music lies a question that's now waiting to be answered by us all. The lullaby Samuel and Evelyn brought into the light has become more than just a melody. It has taken on a life of its own, spreading through Boston and beyond as a symbol of memory renewed, a testament that simple songs can outlive tragedy and carry whole worlds of unspoken stories inside their notes. In community gatherings and living rooms, people now hum the lullaby, sharing its story with children who know nothing of loss, but now carry its echo gently in their hearts. Teachers include it in lessons of resilience, interfaith services open with its refrain, and memory events play it softly to remind attendees that remembrance need not be solemn, but can bloom through song. The cafe where it all began has transformed into a sacred space, not of mourning, but of remembrance in motion. Patrons, some unaware of the origins, pause before a modest plaque bearing the words, "Where a song saved a life," touching the metal as if to trace its meaning, thinking back on their own memories shaped by music and connection. New visitors seek it out, asking the barista about the story of the veteran who played a lullaby that made a survivor cry. Newcomers listen, eyes glisten, and slowly a communal story grows, nourished by the simple act of telling. From news bulletins to whispered conversations in classrooms, Evelyn and Samuel's story is shared not as a rare tale, but embraced as a template, that survival, grief, and love can be honored through a melody, and that the act of remembering is itself an act of rebirth. Families now bring children to that cafe, even if they do not know yet why, so that one day the quiet heartbeat of that lullaby will be part of who they become, not just what they know, and in that, the lullaby has transcended its origin, no longer just a link to past suffering, but a living testament to what memory can do when held with tenderness, how grief can be transformed, not by forgetting, but by giving voice to the unspoken. It has become a gift offered to anyone who will receive it, a fragile flame that refuses to be extinguished. Now, as you hear this story, what will you do with your memory? Will you let it lie dormant, silent and solitary, or will you breathe life into it, share it, let it shape someone else's understanding of history and humanity? Stories such as these remind us, remembrance is not passive. It requires action, whether through song, conversation, or quiet preservation. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe so we can continue sharing real-life narratives that touch, inspire, and awaken compassion. Share it with someone you care about, because memory shines brightest when it is shared.